How can you possibly have a modern country when you have these types of religious extremists? I mean, what do you do with these people? Can you rehabilitate them? Do you simply have to wipe them off the surface of the earth? Or are you constantly going to be in this quasi-civil war with them?
Well, it's a difficult one because a lot of people argue that the West made the mistake of not including the Taliban in peace talks right from the beginning, and seeing whether they would be willing to be part of Afghan society, have a part in this government, and start to be assimilated, integrated into the police and the army, and work alongside others. I don't know whether that would have been the case because clearly they have no interest in working or compromising at all. In the last few days, they said we want unconditional power. Initially, the agreement was there'll be a transitional government for 6 months where someone will just step in until an agreement is made in terms of it will be a 50-50 arrangement, whose responsibility will be, what. But they said we're not coming back without 100%, and that's it. And we want the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, nothing less than that. So it's a difficult question to answer. I think probably a lot of people thinking that with a group like that existing, if we stay 20, 30, 40, 50 years, if they're still going to come back and retrain and regroup, what's the point? But I think if we had stayed for longer, like we have in, I know the US are still in South Korea. We stayed for a very long time in Germany. We're in Cyprus, and you've got Hong Kong. We've got army and soldiers all around. But by persisting and enduring, you develop a society that eventually can fight on its own. I think 20 years was too early. Had you given it 40 years, or probably a little bit more than that, potentially you would have created a society that was resilient and would have been able to stand on its own 2 feet and fight independently. But you've pulled everything way too quickly, expecting them to just deal with it on their own.
Well, the counter-argument, and a lot of people have made, including we've recorded the interview, but he will be our former guest because we recorded him before, Rakib Ehsan from the Henry Jackson Society, and he's written a piece in Spiked talking about the fact that actually many of the things that you've put, and of course you're entitled to put them to us, about the progress that's been made in Afghanistan over the last 20 years is Western wishful thinking more than reality. For example, he quotes polls from only a few years ago, which show that 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan want Sharia law, 94% think that wives should always obey their husbands, 85% think the penalty for adultery should be stoning, and on we go. So if we've been in Afghanistan that long, and with all of the things that you've talked about, girls going to school and university, being free from wearing headscarf, whatever, really, have we made that much progress there? Has society moved on? Particularly, and maybe it's also, there's 2 questions in what I'm saying. That's the first part, have we made enough progress? And the second part is it maybe just a weakness of Western liberal democratic thinking that if you are Islamist fundamentalist and you believe that if you sacrifice yourself on the battlefield, you're going to go to heaven, where you're going to be surrounded by virgins, and you're fighting against someone who's fighting for human rights and freedom, it's not quite as strong a motivating force to fight and to die and to sacrifice your life for something. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So those 2 questions, talk to us about that.
The first, I would say, if that was the case and we actually haven't made much of a difference, you wouldn't be seeing people fleeing today. If they wanted to live under such a system, why is it that you're constantly seeing videos of people running towards airplanes?
Well, because they worked with the West and now
most
they're
of
going
them,
to be punished.
a lot of them haven't. Most of those people that were running hadn't worked with the West, and they were just ordinary Afghans. Some who just wanted to get away. I think one of the issues in the last couple of days that I've seen is that a lot of the people that were in the airport weren't actually from Kabul, and the majority weren't people who had fought and worked with the West. It was just ordinary Afghans who were trying to find an opportunity just to get into the airplane with no documents, no passport, anything like that. So if that was the case, they wouldn't be running. And I say this, I think the other problem I'm having is that I come from Afghanistan. I have family. I have friends. I've traveled there. And yet, when I hear people telling me that that country hasn't progressed or the mentality hasn't, I dispute that, because I feel like we need to hear from Afghans a lot more. And that's the other problem with this, is that when I was talking about the fact that Afghans are a very marginalized group, even in the West, their voices aren't heard very much. I mean, you've got Caribbean, you've got the Black community, you've got South Asia. When I talk about South Asia, I talk about Indian and Pakistanis, and so many others. And a lot of them have, of course, been here much, much longer in Britain. Afghans are newly arrived, 15, 20 years.
You're being heard now, Shabnam. You're right
Which is
here.
great. It took us 20 years, yes. We've come to the point
Look,
now.
we've only been doing this for 3 years, so you're the first Afghan on the show, I believe, and you're very welcome here. But look, what I'm talking about is opinion polls, right? This isn't he said, she said, etc. And of course, there will be people fleeing war, there will be people fleeing the Taliban, there will be people who don't want to live under Sharia law, as your parents and your family didn't. But what I'm asking is, has Afghan society really moved on as much as we'd like to think?
I think I'm not going to disagree that Afghanistan is a very complex society. And I think I mentioned a little bit earlier that it's a tribal society that lives under tribal practices. And, that the woman's role is not out in the public. That, women should have more than, 5 children, and, very religious, very, very fundamental. But it takes time to help people get out of that mindset. The other problem is that a lot of the change were in cities like Kabul.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
And there wasn't much intervention, and these sort of big NGOs were being funded by foreign governments, but their work was being delivered in the capital cities. And I find issue with that as well. We weren't actually funding community-led activities by activists all across Afghanistan on a grassroots level. This was all done by Save the Children or Oxfam, all these major organizations that were working with community groups and civic society activists in cities with well-established groups already, with people that spoke English. I guess they wanted, it was easier for them, wasn't it? To work with people that understood the system, that could communicate with them. It would have been a lot harder to go to a rural place where English wasn't spoken and then trying to deal and figure out how to work around that. So, they took the easier option and the easiest way out to change and bring about change in Afghanistan. So that could have been one of the cause for the fact that the poll said that a lot of people were still quite traditional in their mindset. But it takes time. It really does. It's not an easy... I think people fail to understand how backward Afghanistan really was, and probably still is, in like you said, in rural areas. There is no country around the world that has suffered from over 40 years of conflict, from 1978, ongoing, that does not have any system. I remember when I first went, even in 2001, there was sewers out in the open. People would go to the toilet and it would come out into the road. The roads needed fixing. The houses are very old, made out of clay and mud. So to think that you can change a country like that is tribal, that is traditional, that is practically living in the first century so quickly, is very naive. It's something, we've failed to really study Afghanistan properly, first of all, to understand its people, its culture, where we've started, what kind of country we were actually intervening in. And for example, people compare it to Iraq, but Iraq was a very developed country before Saddam.
Yeah.
And so was Syria. Afghanistan's not the same. It's completely different. And the interventions were different. We were fighting extremism in Iraq and Syria and fighting Daesh. But before our interventions, before Saddam, before Assad, these were very, very modern, westernized, liberal societies.
And stable societies.
Very stable. Business, economy, freedom. Afghanistan's not the same. And what I try to emphasize to anyone that compares is, please don't compare, because Afghanistan is a unique case. It's never been a developed society.